Well, welcome to the IASS, the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies. Tonight we're going to be bringing you a panel discussion called Climate Engineering, Saving the Skies or Playing God. Now, this panel discussion is attached to a workshop that we've been holding for the past couple of days, and we'll finish it off tomorrow. The workshop is about the broader issue of religious and spiritual perspectives on climate engineering. And up front, I would like to emphasize that at the workshop and also at this panel discussion, we are not going to be talking about how to go about doing climate engineering. And I'll also emphasize that we're not talking about how to use religious or spiritual perspectives to ever justify doing climate engineering. Neither of those is topics of these workshops. Rather, what we're looking at is what do the various religious and spiritual traditions have to say about climate engineering, and how might the consideration of climate engineering actually affect the future development of these religions and spiritual traditions. So then, what exactly is climate engineering? Climate engineering is a set of ideas. It's an umbrella term for a very broad set of ideas for how it may be possible to go about to ameliorating climate change in addition to, or perhaps even, as some people suggest, in place of mitigation, reducing emissions, and adaptation. Now, climate engineering comes in two basic flavors. One of those is what you see on the bottom of the slide here, which is the idea of removing greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide. And there's all sorts of ways that have been proposed for this, such as taking it out directly at power plants, or free air capture of carbon dioxide, or removing it through the oceans in some manner, such as fertilizing plankton. Now, of course, as you can imagine, each of these has its possibilities and each of these has its uncertainties and its risks. And these uncertainties and risks are a major reason why this needs to be discussed in various social fora, and the perspectives from religions and spiritual groups is one of these types of social fora, which is what we're doing tonight. The other flavor of climate engineering is the so-called solar radiation management, or more generally, radiation management. And this is the idea of reflecting back more sunlight to space through either mirrors in space or particles in the upper atmosphere, or through making clouds more reflective, or possibly making the surface more reflective. And by reflecting back more sunlight is the idea of cooling the Earth. And again, for all of these are the same goes. Many people claim that there is some potential, but of course there are also many uncertainties and many risks that need to be considered. So the panel discussion tonight is going to go into a little bit of the practitioner side of this as well. The workshop that we're having is from an academic standpoint, so these are researchers that have come together to discuss this issue, but on the panel we'll also have a couple of practitioners to give you more of a direct practical perspective on this issue. And joining me tonight on the panel then are four distinguished panelists. The first one to my right is Dieter Gerten. Dieter is a co-organizer of this workshop. The workshop that we're hosting these couple of days in the panel discussion is a joint effort of the IASS together with the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. And along with Dieter, in addition, Stefan Schäfer and Achim Maas have been co-organizing the workshop with us. Directly to my right is Michael Northcott, who is a professor from the University of Edinburgh, who will be representing in particular the Christian and the Abrahamic, let me be more specific and say the Abrahamic traditions. To my left is Venerable Vivekananda from the Pundita Rama Meditation Center in Lumbini, Nepal. And Venerable Vivekananda, as you can probably guess, will be representing the Buddhist tradition. And to my far left is Shlomo Shoham, who is a retired judge and former member of the Parliament of Israel, and he will be representing the Jewish tradition. So I'd like to start off with a question to Dieter, who happens to have organized two previous workshops, not on the issue of climate engineering and religions, but on the broader issue of climate change and religions. And Dieter, I'd like to ask you now, after these couple days that we've had so far, what kind of differences do you see between the connections between religions and climate change, and the connection between religions and climate engineering?
Okay, thanks for this question. I actually noted the difference because I think the major difference is that the climate change is about, and as it is being discussed by religious in religious circles also, is about unintentional effects that humans do to the climate system, while the climate engineering seems to be a deliberate act to act against the climate change. So that's seems to be a fundamental difference between the two things, which are also of interest if you discuss about them from ethical and religious viewpoints. However, I see some kind of perverted logic in that. So why should one go for let climate change happen and then do things to make the impacts less bad than they would be without this climate change? So they are. That's an interesting new phenomenon that is of interest not only from the natural scientific viewpoint but also from a religious scientific viewpoint, I guess. So that led me to think about, well, what are the motives for climate engineering actually? And I think, or I hope it is to avert bad impacts to the globe. It can be framed differently, but my hope is that the intention to do climate engineering is to avoid excessive impacts to the global community, to humans and also to ecosystems. So that makes the setting of climate engineering even more complicated than the setting of climate change, which we have discussed in the previous workshops on religion in climate change. And a major outcome, by the way, of those workshops was that religions really have, that it's very ambivalent things. So you have within different religions, different viewpoints on how to respond to climate change, to accept it as a fact or not. That's also the sort of questions we discussed today and yesterday. And the major finding of the other workshops was exactly this ambivalence of opinions on the topic and also of theological explanations of the topics. And a major thing in this was actually that, and it has been often mentioned, especially from evangelical communities and others, that there's God's omnipotence, that humans actually are not able to modify the climate. So the global climate change actually cannot be, because climate and the earth is God's creation, and humans do just not have the power to intervene in that. But now if we discuss climate engineering, that's a kind of deliberate intervention into exactly the global climate. So if that is being discussed from a religious viewpoint, it somehow accepts the paradigm that humans are able to modify the climate somehow. So I think this climate engineering perspective adds some new, interesting, and even more complicated points to the discussion what religions can say to the climate change problem. So that's what I took from these 2 days. It's even more ambivalent, it's even more complicated, and it's really a hot topic to be addressed from natural scientific viewpoint, but also from the humanities, including the religious sciences.
Okay, thank you very much, Dieter, for that form of opening statement. And now I'm going to give each of the other three panelists an opportunity to give sort of a form of an opening statement representing their specific traditions that they are here representing. And in the form of the same question to all three of them. So, and the question is then, first off, to what extent do you think that climate engineering is a relevant issue for the specific tradition that you're representing, given the many other pressing problems that there are currently to be dealing with in the world? Second off, if it is relevant, what kind of a stance do you think, and on a very brief answer perspective on that, do you think will be taken by this particular tradition? And the final one is, are there any specific actions do you think will be recommended by the tradition? So, and address any components of that you would like within the answer, and also note that we have this umbrella term of climate engineering back here, but you might want to specify into specific types either for the solar radiation management or the carbon dioxide removal, as you please, or just use it as a blanket term. Michael's going to be first on this.
Thank you very much. I should first say a big thanks to the organizers of this very interesting workshop that has brought people of different faiths together and from different disciplines, which is at least as challenging, if not more challenging, to discuss these issues. I come here as a theologian, something of a social scientist as well, but with a long-standing interest in ecological and climate science as an amateur. As to the relevance of climate engineering to the Christian faith traditions, you'll find very few statements from Christian leaders on this matter. There's been an explosion in interest in academia in the last 3 to 4 years in climate engineering, and it's growing all the time. The reason for the explosion in interest is quite simply that it is proving very difficult to engineer the politics of climate change to mitigate the effects of the vast amount of CO2, methane, primarily, that we are putting into the atmosphere. There's a growing fear in the scientific community that the effects of these are becoming dangerous to the stability of human life and human settlement, and are already affecting some parts of the world in very bad and deleterious ways. Now, you can find many statements of the faith communities of the Christian churches on that matter. They have argued that an understanding of the earth as God's creation and an understanding of justice as a central part of the teaching of the Christian tradition require that the nations that have it in their power and wealth to rapidly resile from the use of fossil fuels should do so urgently in order to stem the impacts of climate change, particularly on poor farmers, fishers, and others in developing countries whose governments have no resources to protect them from growing extreme weather events. So, in terms of the very recent development, but rapid development of interest on quite a large scale in climate engineering, there has not been yet a formal faith response. I can find nothing from the World Council, for example, my own Anglican Communion, or indeed from the Pope, or the Lutheran World Federation. If these communions were to make a response, it seems to me it would very largely be against. I cannot envisage many theologians or church leaders speaking up for the prospects of this kind of intentional intervention in the state of the climate. But of course, increasingly, when one looks at it from a Christian point of view, when we bring in this word intention, it does raise the issue of what is currently happening in the energy fossil fuel market and the whole politics and economics of climate change. I mean, I think the nations could have argued, say 20 years ago, that if they were continuing to commission large amounts of coal, oil, and gas extraction from their territories to be marketed and sold on world markets, they could have said that there was an unintended, or sometimes it's called a double effect of this on the climate, for which they were not responsible. But since the inauguration of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, it seems to me that the position which says it's unintended, that this quantity of coal that we're mining, this quantity of oil and gas that we're taking out and selling and marketing, that's unintended action by the nation, is no longer sustainable. So for me, the really important issue in intention is not so much intentional climate engineering as is being considered by some scientists, but the fact that in effect, we are already intentionally engineering the climate. Far from resiling in our use of fossil fuel, the very prospect that there might be a global agreement at some point in the future to restrain fossil fuel extraction has led to an orgy of fossil fuel extraction in the last few years. So you have Indonesia selling 10 times the quantity of coal it sold in 2000 to China at this point in time. Australia doing the same. Even the US has doubled its coal exports. So for me, the issue of the role of religion and ethics, particularly from a Christian standpoint in all this, is that those who will be most affected are those who are least able to defend themselves And the duty of those with power and wealth is to use it in a way to mitigate and thence begin to repair and heal the climate.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. So we'll pass it on to Venerable Vivekananda for the next statement.
Thank you very much, Mark. So you're asking the question about the relevance of the issue of climate engineering for the Buddhist communities. Obviously, there's not just one single Buddhist community, but many different forms of it. And so I will try to generalize. The following reasons are there why this issue of climate engineering might be relevant for the Buddhist communities. Number one, to learn about the high impact forms of climate engineering measures, to assess them, and certainly, if necessary, to reject them. Now, maybe allow me to add at this point that a certain amount of exposure of the Buddhist community to the topic of climate change is there, but when it comes to the topic of climate engineering, hardly anything has been published. So we have to keep this in mind. It's a really new topic for the Buddhist community. The second reason, when it comes to the low impact climate engineering measures, then again, we need to study those, assess them, and if they conform to other necessary conditions, such as international frameworks, if they can comply with Buddhist ethical considerations, etc., then to apply them. Now, the next sub-question that Mark had asked, what's the overall stance that you think your community will take on climate engineering? So, the overall stance of the Buddhist community to climate engineering is rather critical. The Buddhists' ideal for humanity's relationship with animals, with plants, and the landscape is one of harmonious cooperation. And we see us as human beings as a part of the community of sentient beings. So there's not only us as human beings, but there's also the world that consists of the animals, the birds, the fish, and insects, and so on. And so the Buddhist, in short, the Buddhist attitude is one of not manipulating nature, and also of not trying to conquer and dominate it. Maybe to briefly refer back to a paper that was read this morning by Martin Schoenfeld, the Buddhist stance is in this regard very close to Taoism. Now, Mark's third question was, are there specific actions on the topic that could be taken within your community that you would recommend? Well, Buddhists would support mitigation measures over climate engineering measures, and the specific ones would be things like an increase of tree planting, so a very simple, low-impact climate engineering measure. Secondly, a voluntary reduction of energy consumption, and as a third possibility, a voluntary reduction of meat consumption. Now, when it comes to the reduction of meat consumption, in the West, this will probably go down well. Many people would pick up this idea. In traditional Buddhist countries, this may not necessarily be the case. I'm fully aware of this. So, in general, we are learning from a Buddhist, certainly speaking from a Buddhist perspective, that money and consumption do not buy happiness, and certainly there are other forms, other ways that lead us to inner happiness and contentment that is not based on the indulgence in sense pleasures or consumption. And experiencing this ourselves, we then also try to live accordingly. That's your turn.
Okay, thank you very much, Venerable Vivekananda. So we'll move to the final opening statement, which is going to be given by Shlomo Shoham. And Shlomo has prepared a few slides with a few quotes that he would like to bring into this.
Hello. Thank you all very much. Before I begin to talk, I want to say a few words. And there are two things I want to mention. First, the quotes that you're going to see are my choice. I choose them out of enormous quotes that will be relevant to this conversation. And the conclusion I will draw from them is also not an objective conclusion. It's something that has to do with my living in an Orthodox family in my childhood and even a bit later, and also learning in yeshiva for many years. So they are not only logical, they have also kind of an emotional part of it, and hopefully you will see it. What we'll do, I will read the quotes, and I will leave some kind of space for you to realize what they say, and then I'll draw my conclusion, and they will be very short, 4 bad news and 4 good news. So the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. This is Genesis, we all know. And there is a Midrash. The Midrash is kind of a story on this sentence. And the Midrash says, when God created Adam, he showed him all the trees in the Garden of Eden and said, see how nice and how beautiful is the world. I have created this for you. Be aware not to spoil and destroy my world. If you spoil it, nobody will fix it. And then there is another quote from Genesis. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. The third is a story of Honi the Sinclair. Honi we say in Hebrew, but it will be easier for you to pronounce Honi. He was actually the first guy who did climate engineering. He drew a circle, not the first, but the most famous, let's say, in the Jewish tradition. He drew a circle on the ground, and he said to God, you didn't bring any rain this year, so I will not move this circle until the rain will come. And the rain came. So the other story about Honi was that afterward he went to sleep for 70 years. So when he went to sleep for 70 years, he woke up and he saw an old guy planting a cherub tree. And he was very much aware of the time that passed. And he said, why are you planting a cherub tree? Don't you know that when the cherub tree will give fruits, you will be dying? So then the old man said, as I came to a world planted with trees, I will plant trees for the generations to come. The other quote is about Sinai. In Mount Sinai, when the covenant created and God made this kind of covenant with the people of Israel then, it said that he is making the covenant with everyone who is here with us today before the Lord our God and with whoever is not here with us today. and Rashi says, and with those who are not with us here today, this refers to future generations. The other side of the mentality of the Jewish people, even nowadays, is a bit more problematic. In the Pesach Haggadah we say, this is what have stood by our fathers and us, for not just one alone has risen against us to destroy us, but in every generation they rise against us to destroy us. And the Holy One, blessed be He, saves us from their hand. So many of the Jewish people nowadays lives in a way they are separated from the world. And there is always one demon that is trying to kill them, or to kill us if you want. That we see ourselves on one hand as a chosen people. Let's say the Jews seeing themselves on one hand as a chosen people. And on the other hand, they are afraid that somebody, because of jealousy or whatever, will kill them. This is what we'll talk about it tomorrow, what I call the survival mode of the Jewish people. So, and the last one refers to a tree. When you cut a fruitful tree, its soundless sound goes over and over around the whole world. These are the quotes. And here are the news. The bad news. Judaism, on its way from the tree of life to the tree of knowledge, good and bad, created one of the main separation concepts that had an influence on the Western religions along the history. 2. The first story in Genesis is on a murder that derives from the jealousy and the fight on whose way to God is best. 3. A huge part of the Jewish people, mainly the Orthodox nowadays, still see the Jewish people as separate from the world, victims of demon, the non-Jewish threat that threatened us every generation, past, present, and future. And 4th, as I said, this survival mode will not take us to the necessary mode for creating the future. And the good news. There is a huge space for mercy and grace in the Jewish tradition. Natural responsibility is emphasized in the story of Honida and Circular for planting trees for future generations. 3. The Sinai covenant and intention to bring the Jewish moral values to future generations, all generations, till the end of generations. 4. There is a new stream of Judaism that focuses on Tikkun Olam, mainly in Israel, Europe, and the USA, which means being part of the global community, which asks the question, how can we best help to create a desired future for the whole planet by using the wisdom developed throughout the Jewish history? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Shlomo. So you've gotten opening statements from each of the panelists so far, and I think given the advanced time, since we're already shortly after 6, and we started a little bit late, but I think we'll also go a little bit over, be able to go perhaps 10 minutes over before we leave for the reception that we have, I'd like to go ahead and open it up to the floor. I think this would be a good opportunity to have questions from the floor. So, who would like to start with the first question? And if I have no volunteers, then I have a few more up my sleeve while your cogs are turning. Okay, then. Great. Miles Kessler, would you like to
So actually, it'll be
question?
a short question, and it's kind of, excuse me, it's in connection with what Shlomo just said in Tikkun Ulam, the healing of the world. And I suspect that this is in, I know it's in, you say it's in new Jewish thought, relatively new. I don't know if it's connected to the early texts. But maybe each of the traditions from Christianity or from Buddhism and from Judaism could comment if there is something at the core of those religions that advocates a healing of the world, a tikkun ulam.
Take that first, Shlomo.
Okay. So first, the concept of Tikkun Olam is based on the text, actually, from the Bible, through the Midrashim, through the Gemara, and all the years. There is kind of polarities. On one hand, the separation that we have to be aware of the others, but on the other hand, there is, the prophecy and also the commands, let's say, that we have our responsibility to heal the world. And this healing the world, the way many of Jewish people see them today, is not being the chosen people, is being part of the global world, being a holistic part of the global world, being in an eye level with everybody on this planet, and really listening, like we call total listening what are the needs of our planet nowadays. And if you now go to the question of geoengineering, that I won't go further now, the first thing to do, in my opinion, according to the Jewish religion, is to have this kind of total listening, to listen carefully what are the real needs of the planet, of the whole planet, not the real needs of somebody, not the real needs of any country, not the real needs or interests, as we heard today, of anybody else, but the needs of the planet as a planet. So this, I think, will be, as I may say, the mainstream of the contribution of the Jewish people to the world in the future generations.
Okay, thank you, Shlomo. I think that will be probably pretty common across the Buddhist and the Christian traditions as well. Is there anything different that either of you would like to add to this, Michael or Vivekananda?
Maybe one or two points. First one is that in the first place, in the Buddhist tradition, we try to live in harmony with nature, in balance with nature. So there is no need for any imbalance. However, situations do occur when this is not the case. Now, there's one discourse in the Anguttara Nikaya entitled Unrighteous, Adamika Sutta in the Bani scripture language. And in there, the Buddha first describes what happens when the kings are unrighteous, then the royal vassals become unrighteous, etc. And eventually it leads to an impact on the climate. And on the other hand, the Buddha says, and I'm quoting, translation by Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi, when kings are righteous, the royal vassals become righteous. When the royal vassals become righteous, Brahmins and householders become righteous. When Brahmins and householders become righteous, the people of the towns and countryside are righteous. When the people of the towns and countryside are righteous, the sun and moon proceed on course. When the sun and moon proceed on course, the constellations and the stars proceed on course. And then when the sun and moon proceed on course, day and night proceed on course. And then the months and fortnights proceed on course. The seasons and years proceed on course. When the seasons and years proceed on course, the winds blow on course and are dependably. When the winds blow on course and dependably, the deities do not become upset. When the deities do not become upset, sufficient rain falls. When sufficient rain falls, the crops ripen in season. When the people eat crops that ripen in season, they become long-lived, beautiful, strong, and healthy. So this is compared is summarized by 4 verses, and the last one of which I would like to share with you. So too among human beings, when the one considered the chief conducts himself or herself righteously, other people do so as well. The entire kingdom rejoices if the king is righteous. Now, in this context, obviously, the term of righteousness needs to be explained, and when consulting the similar discourses where the term righteousness, unrighteousness appears, then it means living in accordance with the Dhamma, upholding the Dhamma being the teaching of the Buddhas. So when we conduct ourselves in line with the Dhamma, and that then includes respect and care for nature, then things will be on course, otherwise not.
Okay, thank you very much, Venerable. So I think we can all hope for righteous leaders, and all of us that are in leadership positions, if we act righteously, then it will hopefully cascade out to a righteous planet. So may I ask for a second question from the floor? Jace Weaver.
Thank you. All three of our presenters speaking out of a faith tradition seem to be negative about the possibilities for climate engineering from the stance of those faith traditions. In the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition, there is a sense that humanity is grasping in the tasting of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, or in the Babel story, and that perhaps this is also grasping this climate engineering. And then I'd like a comment from you, Michael, and you, Shlomo, and then perhaps from the Venerable, from the Buddhist tradition.
I argued in a lecture I gave nearly 2 days ago now that the Christian and Jewish traditions both have an understanding of an interactive relationship between God, human beings, and creation. In the Jewish tradition, and the word continues into the Christian, we call this covenantal. I would argue, and I have done in my writing, that this is a cosmic covenant. In other words, it's clearly perceived by the lawmakers of ancient Israel, by the prophets, as being a covenant, a political covenant, which clearly has effects upon the land and the creatures that live on the land. So righteous rulers, righteous leaders, above all, as it turns out in Israel, a righteous king, which it turned out was a rare thing, but the psalmists and the prophets envisage that righteous rule will produce rain in due season, sunshine in due season, plentiful crops. If you like, this is, and I said in my lecture on Tuesday, it's a form of moral engineering. I don't like to use this word, but nonetheless, just to make the analogy, and I think the analogy is important. Because what is required then in the Christian and the Jewish tradition to live in a world that is in harmony with human rule is a struggle by the world's rulers and the world's people for righteousness. And if they pursue that struggle faithfully, restraining their prideful intents and the sinful tendencies of human beings to dominate one another, the scriptures clearly say they will experience that the world rewards them. It's not just about heaven and heavenly reward. And this is very clearly written right throughout the Old and New Testaments, and it's picked up in Christian practice and Christian art until quite recent times. Now, Christianity is often said to be a tradition which doesn't have this sort of interactive relationship, which is often identified as being, oh, that's what animists believe. Christians don't think like this. But actually, when you look, and I showed examples earlier at Christian art, you can see an enduring influence of this way of thinking, where the divine rule from heaven in the superluminary influences the subluminary through the mediating actions, the networking of God, Christ, human beings, and creatures. Christ being described as the Logos, the sort of life principle in the tradition. So from the Christian perspective then, there certainly is a relationship between one's moral and spiritual work, political rule, and favorable weather. This is a very long-standing. Oddly, it's the modern period which has trained people to imagine that they can live in a world greedily, take too much power to themselves, and not produce ill effects in nature. This is a very modern idea, and this is exactly what we are now having to unlearn because of climate science, paradoxically. That Christianity and Judaism, I would argue, have very important traditions to draw on to underscore what climate science is now teaching us. We cannot live without regard for justice, righteousness, and truth. The planet itself will punish us in the end if we neglect those deep values in human life.
Well, thank you, Michael. That echoes very, very closely what Venerable Vivekananda just told us about if the kings are ruling well, then it will cascade down. And we see the same thing here in the Judeo-Christian traditions, with the righteous rule would give us then a healthy world. So I think to keep the flow of things moving then, since we have quite a similarity between these, if it's okay, I'll move to a next question from the floor, if there's another one prepared. So, Ron Taylor.
Environmentalists often express frustration with religious people, and they wonder where they are. And when they look at what they understand to be the ethics of these traditions, they find them to be exceedingly anemic, that they do not involve deep, at least in their views, understandings of interconnection, mutual dependence, kinship with non-human organisms, and they think that these traditions need a deep infusion of an evolutionary and ecological worldview. They might ask, for example, why should they expect that these traditions would have resources, if you will, for this current crisis when they seem to have had no restraining force on millennia of deforestation in the face of the plow and the decline in biological and cultural diversity that has spread with agricultural civilizations, which these so-called world religions are all an expression of. So, I appreciate the working up and looking toward these traditions for their potential insights on environmental fronts. But my long experience in these areas is that there is not enough soul searching as to the ways in which these traditions have been obstacles as the planet's biocomplexity has eroded. I wonder if you have any, can help those of us who are doubters about the world's religious traditions being salutary as we face this accelerating crisis.
Okay, I think we can maybe take two perspectives on that. Who would, since there are going to be quite some different ones, who would like to field that? Why don't we take out the outside Dieter and Shlomo? And why don't we start with Dieter on this one?
That's really an interesting question. I can only address it as an outsider, so I'm not a religious scientist, but an ecosystem modeler and things. But let me try. I think so you're raising the question why the expectations are so high to religious communities to address the present problem of global climate change, while they did not act toward earlier environmental concerns. And I think it has a bit to do with that we now know really a lot about the global interconnectedness of the problems. So the knowledge of these things and the interconnectedness is much higher than it has been in historic times. So the expectation that religions also draw from their experience and their knowledge can actually be higher, because implicit to religions is the thinking, at least to some of them, the thinking of interconnectedness of things, of a global thinking perhaps, so that we are responsible for people around the world, which is all problems that are being affected by global climate change. So I think there is actually the challenge that religions respond to that, and there's also the potential. But as far as I have seen the literature and heard the discussions, I also recognize a gap between theory, what could be done in religious circles, and what is actually being done in practice. And there I actually see a gap. Is this knowledge, are these capacities really been implemented on the ground. And that's an open question still, why that is the case, at least in many circumstances.
Okay, Dieter, thank you very much. We'll pass it on to Shlomo.
Oh, only the right one works. Yes, I would like to comment on this from a very practical point of view. And this belongs to the good news. I have been a commissioner for future generations in the Israeli parliament, so I have realized a huge change in the, let's say, especially the Judaism in Israel. We have now, let's say, yeshiva for environmentalists. And we have now more and more people who are taking this path even from the Orthodox world. The thing is that the way I see it, we will gain the power and the commitment of the religious people like they do everything with this kind of power emotionally and this kind of commitment. Because if it is an act of God, then they go for it. So more and more I see that people who are dealing with sustainability or with the environmental stuff, we can gain a lot from using, I may say, this platform of the religious people, mainly Orthodox, but also Reform in the Jewish world or the conservatives, using this platform to, let's say, put a new ideology into the Jewish belief or Jewish religions nowadays. And I think this will make a difference.
I think next time you can just leave it on. It probably is okay to leave that there. So this is quite an interesting question that Bron Taylor has put up about the potential for religions to actually contribute. We've been much more focusing on the issue of simply the analysis of where the religions would hold this issue. But I think both of my neighbors have asked me if they can contribute something to this as well. And I think given the interest of this question, we'll go ahead and let both of the other panel members make a quick statement on this as well.
I would say in response that if you look at the history of the environmental movement in the last 200 years, the empirical evidence is very much against what Professor Taylor has just said. Among the first environmentalists in the West were John Muir, son of a Presbyterian, a Scots Presbyterian, lived down the road from where I work in Edinburgh. And in the last century, Rachel Carson, also Presbyterian. I think it's very interesting how strong Presbyterians have been in the environmental movement for the last 200 years. Another very important route for the Christian influence is the Romantic movement, which of course again was Christian and European in origin, 18th century here in Germany and Britain and other parts of Europe. There was a very clear relationship between the Romantic movement and historic Christianity, and many of the forms that the Romanticism took were explicitly Christian. For example, there's a very powerful influence of Hebrew poetry and prophecy on the ways in which the Romantic movement unfolded in the United Kingdom around the writings of William Wordsworth and John Ruskin, just to name two. And Ruskin's philosophy is deeply Christian. And of course, I've just named three people in the last 2 minutes who are responsible for the first major legal conservation initiatives in the Western world in the modern times, which is the setting up of national parks, first in the States and then in Britain. The very fact we have these goes back to Christian influence. So I don't detect in my reading of environmental history, and of course we're scholars here, and scholars are known for disagreeing with each other, and Bron and I have disagreed before, and we're capable of doing it in a very friendly way and over a pint afterwards as well. I don't see in my reading of environmental history the picture that Bron paints, and I would just quote one more bit of evidence. Riley Dunlap did a survey for the Gallup organization, of which he is one of the directors, and clearly showed very strong correlation between Christian religious belief, but more especially Protestant belief, and the growth of environmental protests. So if you look around, he showed this both in Europe and in North America, that the countries where environmental protest begins are all Protestant Christian countries without exception. So I just don't recognize the picture you paint.
Okay, thank you. Venerable?
Bron, we've spoken about this already during the hike after the lunch, and I would like to add to what was said earlier on. First of all, in Buddhist teaching, the law of interdependence is an essential feature. And so for Buddhists, there's no difficulty there whatsoever, since many thousands or hundreds of years. Now, in Thailand, for instance, Venerable Ajahn Bongsak is noted for his activism in terms of deforestation in the north of Thailand. Now, in a more general way, you can you can look at monasteries and nunneries as places where the 5 precepts are being observed. And the first among these 5 precepts is the precept of not taking life, of not killing. And this includes your birds, your snakes, your fish, and what have you. Also, it includes, in an extended sense, to respect certain trees and plants. So in many traditional Buddhist countries, you will find, and this is practically speaking, that the monasteries are basically protected areas. They're like small national parks. And it is common practice in a monastery, even if there's a snake, and if this snake is a poisonous snake, like a cobra, people will not go and kill it, but rather deal with it in ways that are appropriate. So, for instance, avoid it or shy it away, etc., etc. So there's much respect for the environment being practiced from day to day. And it is in a certain monastery in Thailand, outside of Bangkok, that a certain type of bird is, I forgot exactly, a certain type of duck or so, which is an endangered species, and it's present only in that monastery. So these would be actual examples of actual example of Buddhist teachings being extremely relevant to the protection of the environment.
Okay, thank you all for your perspectives. I'd say that what we hear here is that there's certainly a great potential for environmental support and support of environmental activities from the various traditions. I'm going to add one in just a moment, but it's not leading us up to what I think Bron Taylor is talking about, the big one of the major mitigation of carbon dioxide that needs to go on in a very organized fashion worldwide, and so there's still some kind of gap there. I would like to add just very briefly, since the Venerable as a Buddhist monk is not going to pat himself on the back, part of the reason that he's here is that he has been, as a Buddhist monk, very, very active in southern Nepal on the issue of air pollution, and he has helped us considerably with setting up our instrumentation, finding space for this, for a measurements campaign we have right now to look at the pollution there, and also with the next steps for air pollution mitigation. So another example of connections between religions and really environmental activism. So, okay, I'd like to open it up for another question from the floor, and I see Madeline Fleminger would like to pose a question.
I was about to say exactly what you said, that we can take it for granted that every religious tradition and philosophical tradition will stand on the side of the environment and has, for history, in terms of land, air, water, animal life, and will continue to do so. This is environmentalism. But when we talk about climate engineering, I said this earlier, it really is a whole other set of questions. We're not talking about supporting the environment, cleaning the environment in the ways we have been. We're talking about a whole set of really high-pitch, high-tech technologies whose consequences we can't really quite know. And so I think that, yes, religious groups will take a position to it, but it's so fuzzy. where is climate technology in terms of politics, in terms of research? It's not really presented publicly in a way that anybody could respond to it. It's an idea. There's no tension surrounding it. They don't know what they're supposed to react to. Who are they supposed to react to? How are they supposed to engage themselves with these issues and technologies when they don't have the scientific information filtering down from research institutes, not yet, what the consequences are going to be? And I think this is really the main thing. That some religious groups might even say, no, don't even research it. Other ones will say, we have the right to knowledge if you deal with it well. And then when we get the knowledge, when we know everything we need to know about climate engineering, decisions have to be made. And this is the point where religious groups will become vocal. But I think it would be most helpful if we could use this workshop to articulate the kinds of questions that we can ask and we can discuss in a context of a religious community or of religious leadership, or just in terms of religion as a philosophy, looking at these questions. But what kinds of questions are we really asking in this workshop about climate engineering within the context of religious traditions?
Okay, thank you, Madeline. I think, well, as far as I see, that's largely a comment on what we should be doing. Is there anybody that wants to disagree with the comment on that? If we're all going to basically agree with that, then I think we would, more or less agreeing, then I think we can move along to another question. But if there's a disagreement, then maybe we'll let Shlomo have a quick disagreement.
This one, it works. Two things. First of all, according to every religion, we see ourselves as visitors on this planet. And as visitors, we need to really care for the planet and take care of the planet. This is one thing. The second thing is that actually the precautionary principle is also based on religions. I can find basis for this in the Jewish religion. And I didn't hear this principle almost at all in our conversations. Some of the people who talked said something on the precautionary principle, but the precautionary principle says at the end that if you want to interfere in the planet, in any way to intervene in the planet, you need to learn first what are the outcomes, the best that you can know. So this is according to your comment, which I appreciate. Yet there is something that Rabbi Nachman said, which I love. He says, if you believe that there is a possibility to create any damage, believe that there is a possibility to fix it or to heal it.
Okay, thank you, Shlomo. I think we can take one last question from the floor. And way in the back there, Jeff.
I'll stand. Hello? Oh, good. Jeff Arderon, I'm a fellow here at the IASS. I would put it to the panelists, and just for your reaction, that it's not so much whether climate engineering is right or wrong, or whether it's accepted a given belief system, but rather the approach that we take, and if that approach is consistent with the belief system. I think that this might get us around the problem that was mentioned earlier, which is we don't know really what it is yet, because that's true. We don't yet know what it is. And so I think instead, if we could define the respectful or the, whatever word you want to use, approach to climate engineering, that might get us around that problem. I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Well, thank you, Jeff. That you took the words partly out of my mouth. That makes a wonderful lead into closing statements, and given the advanced time, it's actually time for us to run through closing statements. So I'll ask each of the panelists if they could address that question in the sense of a closing statement, and we'll start then at my left with Shlomo.
Okay. I'm thinking how to connect the question with the closing statement. I'm not sure I can do it. So if not, you'll forgive me. When I was dividing the bad news with the good news, you can easily see that the good news are looking for the future. And the closest statement that I may say is that according to the roots of the Jewish religion and the way, let's say, the dress it dresses nowadays, I can see a great hope that the Jewish religion, many of the believers, Orthodox and non-Orthodox, will be part of the ideology of dealing with the climate change. The geoengineering, if it will be with the precautionary principles, in a cautionary way, with a total listening, as I said, will be also part of this common future world.
Okay, thank you. We'll pass it to Venerable Vivekananda.
Well, and Jeff, I would certainly like to point out that climate engineering or geoengineering measures are not a must. This is not something that we must do. This is something that we could consider about and certainly then study very carefully, assess very carefully against a big or long range of, wide range of different conditions, and then maybe decide that we want to pick this or that climate engineering measure. So if we decide to go for such a climate engineering measure, then at least from a Buddhist perspective, it should be one that very much respects life and is done with an attitude of loving kindness and compassion towards all human beings. And that we do this with a mind that is pure and not filled with some very personal, greedy motivations. Okay, that would be one point.
Thank you very much, Venerable. So we'll pass it on to Michael.
In the quote from the Midrash on Genesis earlier, we were told that if human beings wreck the planet or the garden, no one will fix it. I wish to disagree with the quote. The Christian tradition holds that Christ was the Logos, the creative principle, comes into created order, embodied life to fix it, to repair it. Christ's mediation then has this very powerful effect, arguably on the climate and on humans' relationship with other creatures. This is why, for example, in a painting that I discovered recently in Washington, D.C., they have dozens of copies of, and I don't know why they bought so many of this particular painting, but I have my beliefs and speculation about this. In the National Museum in Washington, D.C., you can see dozens of different paintings of Jerome, the monk in the 4th century, living in his cave in the desert, plucking a thorn out of the paw of a lion who just presents it to him. So in that image, you have exactly this idea that Christ, the Logos principle, heals the human relation to creation, even to the extent of healing human relationships in the food chain of one of our potential predators. This is absolutely fascinating. And then if you take this further and you look at the Benedictine tradition, which is arguably historically the most influential Christian tradition over the last 2,000 years in terms of land practices and technologies, from sheep keeping, draining marshes, windmills, accurate timekeeping, all this came out of the Benedictine tradition. All of these are originated as agrarian practices for restoring and reshaping the human relation to nature, making nature more productive, but in ways which are not against nature. So my view is, if there are climate engineering techniques, and I well know there are, which enhance soil quality, which increase tree cover, which restore forests, which increase wild areas, all of these are potentially both ways in which human beings can reduce CO2 in the atmosphere at the same time as improving soil quality and biodiversity, Christians and all people of faith, as well as scientists, can be at one in saying, if that's climate engineering, then we're for it. But of course, the actions I've just described are also about carbon mitigation. They're also about increasing biodiversity. They are about healing our habitat, the habitat of the creatures we share this planet with. So from my perspective, there are indeed ways, and just to be very specific, for example, biochar. This seems to me to be a perfectly viable way to improve soil quality, which has been long practiced for many thousands of years in some parts of the world. And if it's done in a particular way, using modern techniques, it can release relatively little carbon into the atmosphere and store a great deal of carbon in the soil, while also enhancing soil quality. But I end with one more example. In Australia 2 years ago, I was at the headquarters of World Vision, which is quite a large Christian development organization. And I met a man who had been for 10 years of his life in North Africa, on the edge of the Sahara Desert. And he trained the farmers there to replant scrub, native scrub, and interplant native scrub and their own plants. And he had to get the law changed in the national governments of 2 countries to allow this to happen, because any permanent plant on the soil was said to be not in the property of the farmers because of the law. So he had to get the law changed. He eventually got the law changed. And now, actually, from the satellite photographs, you can see the change that small practice, seems relatively small practice, is making to that very endangered part of North Africa. This was a righteous man, a man of faith. I was deeply moved by his story.
Okay, thank you, Michael. And we'll pass it on to Dieter for the final of the closing statements.
Which is a hard job. Well, my impression is that the climate change discourse is really more or less trapped in a technocratic and also economic mindset. But I feel that the underlying crisis is so fundamental, because it's basically about the human nature relationship, which is renegotiated at the moment, obviously, that I hope that the cultural and also religious wisdom that humanity has really has some attractive and creative alternatives to offer. Short conclusion.
Okay, thank you very much, Dieter. So I'd like to sum up then very briefly with 3 basic points that I think we've heard here. The first one is you've gotten a taste of how complex this issue is. Not only is climate engineering issue is complex, but religions in general are complex, and put the 2 together, and we have a tremendous degree of complexity of the interrelationship. Nevertheless, what seems to have shown up in the panel discussion here is that, at least across the representations we've had here, that it appears that the religions are likely to take a generally negative stance on the general manipulation of the Earth system, of the climate on such a large scale, with the one exception that interestingly showed up in 2 ways, that if it were done with either total listening or with loving kindness, which would be an extreme degree of cooperation that we have hardly any precedent for ever historically, and if we could get that kind of degree of cooperation, then perhaps we could get further on mitigation. But under only those circumstances would it be considered appropriate with those specific religious traditions. And the third point is that we've heard that there's actually been very little consideration of this issue amongst religious leaders so far. And when you consider putting together those 3 points, the degree of complexity, the generally negative stance, and the fact that there's been little consideration, if there's a negative stance towards it, and if it is being discussed out there, then it would seem a very important next step is to raise awareness about the issue. And that's what we're doing here with this panel discussion. And we would like to thank you very much for joining us for Climate Engineering, Saving the Skies, or Playing God, and would like to invite you to join us then up in our other building for a nice reception afterwards. Good evening.